Our lives are so intertwined with the Thames River, we hardly ever stop to consider this relationship. The river is key to our physical, emotional, and economic health. We seldom consider the Thames River as a living, breathing organism. However, watching it over time, as across the 4 seasons, reveals how it is constantly moving and changing. Rivers are magical. We often forget that the river is one of the few places that allows us to experience the past, the present, and the future, virtually at the same time. Try it sometime. When you are taking a stroll along the water's edge, look upstream, then look at the water rushing beside you, and lastly, look downstream. Upstream is where the water has already been and has already been influenced by the actions of others. Beside you is where the water is currently lapping by your feet, and downstream is where the water is rushing onward to influence someone else's riverside stroll. The past, the present, and the future, all within one viewpoint. My personal relationship with the river first developed through my love for canoeing and paddling. Therefore, you may notice that many of my examples and points of reference revolve around that activity. I hope you will consider some points to ponder about the river, some facts to impress your friends and relatives, and some mythbusters. Also, I will provide you with some easy tips on what you can do to be a good river steward, either individually, as a family, or as a part of your neighborhood. First of all, let's make sure we're all paddling the same direction regarding our river understanding. Number 1. Rivers move water. That's rather obvious, but they also move sediment. This is commonly forgotten. Moving water moves sediment, both removing it from shorelines through erosion and adding it to them through deposition, depending on the river characteristics. River depth is also usually closely associated with sediment movement. Canoeists quickly find the deepest part of the river to ensure they are not scraping bottom, while fishermen will look for both shallows and the deeper pools to test their angling skills and find their desired catch. This photo illustrates the point that sediment in suspension in the water has made a bathtub ring on the side of the canoe. It is easy to see that this portion of the river is sediment-rich. Time-lapse animation using a series of photos taken from the air shows a reach of the Thames River in London over time. It provides a glimpse of the evolution of the river at one location through 8 decades. It shows how sediment is deposited and removed from an island depending on the river characteristics that year. This example shows the river is virtually in constant change. Number 2. Someone lives downstream. Rivers are a part of a system. No matter where you are located, another landowner, another community, or another species of animals that uses the river is located downstream. They are therefore potentially impacted by your interactions with the river. It is up to you to ensure that your impact is positive, not negative, but more on that later. To illustrate the point about who lives downstream, this map shows the watershed boundary in black and the changes in elevation as the river flows downstream from top right to bottom left. That means it flows from the higher ground, shown in red in the upper watershed, to the lower ground, shown in green in the lower watershed. Given the large expanse of green in the lower, it's possible to visualize how much flatter it is than the upper region. At its westerly end, the river empties into Lake St. Clair at the community of Lighthouse Cove. Here, the river becomes a wide, slow-moving freshwater estuary where lake waves can move upstream and river currents can push water and sediment downstream. A watershed, also called a drainage basin, is an area of land where rain and melted snow converge to a single point, commonly where a river empties into a lake or ocean. It is the gathering place for the waters that eventually feed the river. The boundaries of these watersheds are typically higher elevations, where the water sheds from one side to the other, flowing to different creeks through different watersheds. As shown in the graphic, the watershed has connections to the air above via the water cycle and to the ground below via groundwater. The topographic distinction from upper to lower portions of the watershed provides one reason for the formation of two watershed conservation authorities, UTRCA and LTVCA, each one assisting their partner municipalities and communities to manage these lands. The watershed communities in the upper Thames River include Stratford and St. Mary's along the North Thames River and Woodstock and Ingersoll along the South Thames River. These two river branches meet in London at the Forks, where the river continues downstream through the lower Thames Valley, including 4 First Nations, being Oneida, Chippewas of the Thames, Munsee Delaware, and the Delaware Nation, and then flows through Chatham and eventually to the outlet at Lighthouse Cove. This unusual perspective of southwestern Ontario enhances the viewpoint of abundant water. At first glance, it appears it could be the Florida Everglades or a peninsula in the Caribbean. No, it is the elephant view of Ontario looking west with north to the right side. Lake St. Clair is the small lake on the horizon west of London. If you can visualize the elephant shape, you will see that London appears as a necklace around the elephant's neck. In southwestern Ontario, we are fortunate or challenged with abundant fresh water. We are fortunate since London is between Lake Huron and Lake Erie and between Lake Ontario and Lake St. Clair. Our drinking water comes from 2 of these lakes. Lake Huron provides 85% of our drinking water, while Lake Erie provides 15%. Each site takes water from the lake by way of a large pipe and then treats it for drinking. This close proximity to the Great Lakes means we are the thunderstorm capital of Canada in the spring and summer and experience snowstorms and streamers off the lake in the winter. I mentioned we are challenged in that, in several ways, we take water for granted since it appears to be so plentiful. In a 2011 study completed by Probe Research for the City of London, only 6 out of 10, or 62% of London adult residents, could name the source of their drinking water. This awareness statistic is slightly lower than the provincial average and slightly lower again than the national average on drinking water awareness. Apparently, 4 out of 10 of us just turn on the tap without considering the source. Number 4. Rivers tend to flood at times. Having previously stated that rivers move water, that someone lives downstream, and that we in southwestern Ontario have an apparent abundance of water, it shouldn't come as a surprise that rivers also tend to overflow their banks, creating floods. London has a long history of flooding dating back to the 1800s. Our most recent significant flood was in 1937, where unfortunately a human fatality was also recorded. As described in Chris Doty's 1997 documentary film titled Lost April, The Flood of 1937, the Thames River ravaged through London, including Thames Park, for 3 days in April. The river reached 8 meters or 23 feet higher than average. The video cameraman was Charlie Ford, a local businessman who had police permission to film behind the road barricades. And in 1937, this must have been a prototype video camera. Despite London being a smaller city than today with only 75,000 residents, over 1,000 homes were washed out. 1 in 20 residents were left homeless, and property damage was in the millions of dollars. Again, remember that this was 1937, and people were just recovering from the Great Depression. The force of the floodwater moved houses from their foundations on Front Street, now Watson Park, floated cars like popsicle sticks in West London, and submerged houses in the coves so that rescue boats paddled into second-story windows to rescue owners. That one event influenced floodplain management and helped spur on the creation of the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority in the 1940s, the building of Fanshawe Dam in the 1950s, and increased floodplain policies and the creation of the Lower Thames Valley Conservation Authority in subsequent decades. This map, taken from the 2010 London Flood Atlas, shows the 1937 flood-prone lands in blue along the river. Note, the map is also an unusual perspective, oriented so west is at the top and north is at the right side. The river flows from right to left. It shows the North Thames flowing past the TD Waterhouse Stadium built on the floodplain on the grounds of UWO, then past Gibbons Park before skirting the edge of West London, where several hundred homes are protected behind the West London Dyke, shown as a black dashed line. Many of the houses on this map are the same ones that sustained damage in 1937. So what are some river facts that we should be aware of in order to properly understand, help manage, and protect the river? 1. The Thames River was first called Ascanissapi or Antler River by our First Nation peoples, given its various branches like the antlers of a deer. 2. Considering all the branches, the Thames River is over 270 kilometers long in total length from the headwaters in Ellis Swamp, north of Stratford near the North Branch, and from Tavistock, north of Woodstock near the Middle and South Branches, to where it spills into Lake St. Clair at Lighthouse Cove, west of Chatham. Water takes 7 to 10 days to make that trip from headwater to outlet. 3. The entire watershed of the Thames River, being all the land that drains into the river, is 6,600 kilometers squared, the third largest Ontario River watershed. London is located about halfway between headwater and outlet. 4. Similar to the other topographic map we have been viewing of the watershed, London can also be represented showing just topography, without houses or roads, just with hills and valleys represented through color. Red is the higher elevation and green the lower elevation. You likely know these hills, shown as black dashed lines, that define the sub-watersheds, since anyone traveling from Arva to St. Thomas north to south through London drives over them. The first one you encounter, called the Arva Moraine, is south of Arva, and you descend down into the Masonville Mall area. The second hill, called the Ingersoll Moraine, you climb as you reach Commissioners Road and Victoria Hospital, and the third hill, called the Westminster Moraine, you encounter south of Highway 401 as you reach Regina Monday High School. When we add on the Thames River, we recognize the paths of the north and south branches that meet at the forks. The river flows from east to west through 43 kilometers of river valley and takes approximately 1 day to flow through the city. However, during flood events, that speed increases dramatically to only a few hours. 5. Several major tributaries flow into London and join the Thames River. They are shown in red from top left to bottom right. The creeks named Medway, Masonville, Stony, Mud, Pottersburg, Wabuno, Dingman, Dodd, and Upper Kettle. There now. What do we have? It looks like we've created the last play from the third quarter of the Grey Cup. So to finish this mapping exercise, if we combine the red areas being high points of land called moraines with the low areas where you find the creeks and the river, you are able to determine London's sub-watersheds. Each color represents a distinct sub-watershed. These smaller units all form part of the larger Thames River watershed, or at the south end of the city where we find Dodd and Upper Kettle Creeks, part of the Kettle Creek watershed that flows directly to Lake Erie. Watersheds are described and labeled according to the different scales that are used to analyze them, since they have the ability to nest or fit into one another. For example, Snake Creek and its surrounding watershed, located in London near Wonderland and Gainsborough Road, flows into Medway Creek and becomes a sub-watershed of the larger Medway Creek watershed. Similarly, Medway Creek drains into the Thames River near the University of Western Ontario and becomes a sub-watershed of the larger Thames River watershed. The Thames flows to Lake St. Clair and eventually down the Detroit River into Lake Erie, forming a subcomponent of each of those larger watersheds. Now I know you already know this, that the river connects to Lake Erie. If you grew up in London in the late 1950s and early 1960s, or if you have children who frequent storybook gardens, you already know this river story. That is because the story of an unusual city employee by the name of Slippery the Seal, who became a household name in 1958. This harbor seal, and temporary resident of Storybook Gardens in Springbank Park, took a swim down the Thames River from London, only to be later found days later along the shoreline of Lake Erie across the border near Sandusky, Ohio. 6. In London, your daily habits can influence water quality in the river and creeks. These posters illustrate the three water systems that form the urban water cycle. These systems are managed by municipal staff, but what happens inside your home is beyond their control. As you know, municipal drinking water, the poster on the left, comes into your home. Wastewater, the poster in the center, leaves your home after you have showered or used the toilet. And runoff from your yard and roof flows by way of the storm water system, the poster on the right, to the river. However, most homeowners haven't read their owner's manual and aren't aware they have stewardship or responsibility for these systems. For example, all the water from your yard, including the house foundation drains, stormwater grates on the road, and all overland flow down your road, flows through the watershed into your local creek. If your rusty station wagon parked on your driveway leaks oil or gas, it will eventually reach and contaminate your local creek. The same goes for the wastewater system. There are lots of things you can do. Don't forget that toilets were designed for only one thing. In some homes, toilets have become more like garbage cans used for disposing leftover food, kitchen grease, prescription drugs, and, well, you get the picture. We need to put waste in the right place. And there are lots of other things that can plug sewers and create basement flooding, including tree roots, shown on the poster on the right. So let's consider some river myths. I like to call this part mythbusters. Myth number 1. Stormwater gets treated. If we follow that assumption, it must be okay to dump liquids down the road grate in front of my house. Not okay. London's stormwater system moves stormwater from neighborhoods, roads, and parking areas. Stormwater is rainwater, snowmelt, and nothing else. Stormwater is not treated and outlets directly into area creeks of the river. Therefore, cleaning up streets and neighborhoods can prevent tons of litter from entering the Thames River. Here is my friend to explain it in more detail.
When it's time to take out the trash, you wouldn't think of throwing it out in the street, right? So why do so many people think it's cool to dump household waste down storm sewers? Let me tell you, it's definitely not cool. Do you have any idea where that waste ends up? Right here, in the nearest creek, river, or lake. That's where. And if you think it gets treated first, think again. It goes directly from the storm sewer into the water. What can we do to stop this problem? Well, the first thing is to remember that storm sewers are not garbage cans. You wouldn't believe some of the stuff people dump down here. Motor oil, chemicals, paint, soap, the list goes on and on. Sometimes we don't even know we're doing it. Like when we're washing our cars in the driveway. All the soap and cleaners we rinse off the car end up going straight down a storm sewer into the nearest water source. The only things that should be going down our storm sewers are rainwater, melted snow, and surface water. Everything else needs to be disposed of properly. And when it comes to getting rid of leaves, don't just push them on the street. They could block our storm sewers and create local flooding. Not only is it bad for the environment, disposing of pollutants into a storm sewer, catch basin, or even a ditch is also illegal. And it's up to us to stop it. If you see someone pouring suspicious material down a storm sewer, you should contact the City of London and let them know immediately. You might think, well, it's only a little bit. But that's all it takes to cause huge environmental problems. Want an example? This is 1 liter of motor oil. If it accidentally ended up getting into a storm sewer, say when you were changing your oil, that wouldn't be a big deal, right? Wrong. Just 1 liter of motor oil can contaminate 1 million liters of water. That's 1 million liters of water that we can't drink and that fish can't swim in. Scary, isn't it? So, what can you do to help? First, dispose of all your household waste properly. Sweep up outdoor spills and dispose of them in the trash or landfill if they're not hazardous. For wet spills like oil, apply cat litter or another absorbent material, then sweep it up and put it in the garbage. Dispose of unused chemical products, such as paints and antifreeze, at the local household special waste depot on Manning Drive. Clean your car, windows, or whatever on your lawn, not on your driveway. Your lawn will actually filter out chemicals before they go down a storm sewer. And if you just don't wash your car on the lawn, take it to a car wash. Plus, don't forget, you can prevent spills from happening in the first place by using drip pans. And if you see someone else dumping pollutants, report them to the City of London. It's wrong and it's illegal. Remember, storm sewers are not garbage cans. The only thing that should be going down them is water. If you're even thinking of dumping something else, ask yourself a question. Would I dump this in the Thames River?
No.
The answer is no. Then it shouldn't be going in your storm sewer either. Put waste in the right place, and you'll be protecting our environment too.
Myth number 2. Our plentiful Great Lakes water source will always be plentiful. Not likely. As we learn more about the projected impacts of climate change, large lakes such as the Great Lakes have huge surface areas and act as large bathtubs when warmer air passes over them. This means more evaporation from their surfaces. And since much of this evaporated water blows outside of the watershed, other areas will get the precipitation and it will not replenish our Great Lakes. Much of the Great Lakes are composed of melted glacial water from the last ice age covering Ontario several thousand years ago. Therefore, it is safe to say that we have no glaciers in our forecast to replenish the lakes. We need to protect what we have. Myth number 3. A watershed is not a building that contains bottled water. This is just a review to see if you're listening. This graphic actually shows the correct depiction of a watershed, which is the one you should remember. Myth number 4. The Thames Valley Corridor plan is all about bike paths. Well, bike paths are certainly a component of the plan, however, the goal is much broader. The goal of the Thames Valley Corridor Plan, TVCP, is to protect and enhance the environmental features of the river valley. It will accomplish this while considering the multifunctional role of the river valley system. The plan includes such concepts as natural heritage, stewardship, protection, the working river, recreation, tourism, and celebration. It provides an environmental action plan that integrates mapping and information to protect and enhance the valley corridor, and river awareness is a key reoccurring theme. The Thames Valley River Parkway is actually made up of various parks all located in the floodplain of the Thames River. During floods, these parks and much of the trail system becomes unpassable with floodwater. Although it may not be apparent at first glance, this is a reflection of wise land use management along the river. Developing parks and trails rather than houses and stores means that there is less damage during repeated flooding. Myth number 5. The water quality of the Thames is getting worse. Specifically in London, river water quality has been getting progressively better since the 1960s. Improvements to sewage treatment have played a significant role in water quality improvements, in addition to improvements from industrial and agricultural impacts. Greenway Pollution Control Plant, shown here, is one of 24 in the watershed and one of 6 in London. Watershed-wide, the last complete basin-wide investigation occurred in 1975. Much has occurred since that time, including improvements to all 24 sewage treatment plants in the watershed. These treatment plants are located all across the watershed in all major cities, including Stratford, St. Mary's, Woodstock, Ingersoll, and Chatham-Kent. Attention to the Thames has been ever increasing, including initiatives such as Celebrate the Thames, championed in 1999. This attention was a precursor to the Canadian Heritage River designation achieved in 2000 after several years of research and related work. In 2012, the Clear Water Revival Initiative aims to improve the health of the Thames River. This initiative features a logo with a bullfrog named Jeremiah to attract attention. It seems to be working. Watershed partners are varied, and First Nations, federal and provincial governments, urban and rural communities, and other municipalities are all concentrating their efforts on the entire watershed and how best to care for our Thames River. Tips for stewardship. And how should we be caring for the Thames River? Well, consider the following simple ideas to follow when it comes to your water footprint. Slow it down. Fast-moving water will create erosion and damage property. Soak it up. Porous pavements will allow the land to absorb water and recharge groundwater. Keep it clean. Don't allow contaminants like oil and gas to get into water, however it gets there. 5 things you can do to help safeguard our watersheds. 1. Let water sink into your yard, replenishing groundwater and local creeks, rather than directing it to the storm grate. 2. Naturalize your property. Drought-resistant native plants will need less water. 3. Capture rainwater. Water from your roof could be used to water plants and your yard. 4. Check your water footprint and get into the habit of not wasting water in your daily life. 5. Disconnect downspouts. Historically, too much roof water was directed into storm water drains, creating problems. How to get involved? Participate in the Coves Cleanup, which has been an annual event in this community since 1991, spearheaded by the Friends of the Coves. Host a site in London's Clean and Green event and the Thames River cleanup that happened the same day in April. Join groups like the Friends of Stony Creek, who celebrated their 20th anniversary in 2012 at the Stony Creek Community Center. Get your family involved in Earth Day or any local neighborhood environmental event. If your neighborhood doesn't have one, create one. Our lives are so intertwined with the Thames River, we seldom stop to consider this relationship. The river is key to our physical, emotional, and economic health. The river, combined with the valley that holds it, is London's most important natural, cultural, recreational, and aesthetic resource. Without it, London would be much less interesting, much less connected, and much less alive. We would be without a historical entity and lacking a Canadian Heritage River designation. We would be without a meeting place at the forks of the Thames, where all different peoples have met for centuries. We would be culturally much poorer without Museum London and the Middlesex County Building, both located strategically at the forks. Now is the time for us to share in being stewards of the river, to connect with the river, embrace the river, and enjoy all of the year-round bounty the river has to offer.